Hello. Hopefully you guys can hear me. If you can hear me, nod. No, or at least like comment in the live chat. I'd appreciate it. Give me a second. I'm going to let the rest of the internet know. All right. Give me a second. That was some weird feedback. How do you share a goddamn live stream? All right. All right. So I'm going to get started. I see that there's a couple of people, and I also know that a couple of people did want to, see this video after it finishes. So just to introduce myself, I am Lisette Alvarez, creator of Kalila Stormfire's Economical Magic Services. I use they, them pronouns. I am currently on a staycation, and that's part of the reason why I'm not in my normal space. But I am really, really grateful for this opportunity to talk about the magic behind Kalila Stormfire. The biggest thing I want to kind of mention here is this is due to the fact that we have raised up to 50% of our goal on Seed and Spark for the final season of Kalila Stormfire. So if any of you watching have contributed already, thank you so much. I'm really excited to finish this season and give a closing to a story that means a lot to me, and in a lot of ways has been very magical in my own life. So yeah, I am going to probably start by explaining why I chose this as a public incentive. So when I first started Kalila Stormfire, I meant it to be a reflection of my own magical practices. I have been a practicing pagan and witch since I was a teenager, and to be honest, probably before that, largely because my background includes my very witchy father's side of the family, the Cuban side of my family, who my grandmother and grandfather owned a store, what you would now see as maybe like a new age store in Coral Gables near Miami, Florida, for most of my childhood. I just remember, being in their store and like looking at like statues of angels and books on feng shui in the same like bookshelf, right? And so being able to kind of showcase some of that magic and explain it and explain where this is coming from has been a really compelling thing around Kalila Stormfire in general, but it's also been a thing that I think a lot of listeners have asked about in general when they've come to me and asked me about Kalila Stormfire and the magic behind Kalila Stormfire. And how much of it is, made up and how much of it is, based off of real practices. And I've been pretty open that these are based on pretty much most of the things that are in Kalila Stormfire are based on practices that I myself have been trained on and have used spells and meditations and philosophies and modalities, as some people call them, throughout, my own personal practice. So choosing this as a public incentive is kind of a way for me to give voice to the people who have taught me and the resources that I have used to create a depth within the world of Kalila. Um, and I'm going to particularly, talk about two types of magic and philosophy that informs Kalila Stormfire. The first of which is elemental psychology. I'll start there, and then I'm going to go into shadow work. Both of these things are really central not only to the story, but my own personal practice. Full disclosure, I am an initiate of a tradition called the Order of the Elemental Mysteries, which is headed by Katrina Messenger, who is my teacher and high priestess. And a lot of the work that I do within that order and a lot of the philosophies that kind of surround it are the same kinds of philosophies that you might have heard a lot of in the episodes of Kalila Stormfire. So that's kind of the root really of all of this. Is really kudos to my teacher, to Katrina, for giving me a background in a depth of metaphysical and philosophical and cosmological meaning behind my own stories, and this story in particular. So so I'm going to talk a little bit about elemental psychology because it is a little complex. And it's not actually talked about all that much in Kalila Stormfire, but it underlies almost every interaction Kalila has with her clients. So you probably heard, in the beginning of most of when Kalila talks about her clients, she talks about their astrological sun sign and, their name, their age, their patron, if they have one. But she also mentioned something like introverted intuitive or extroverted thinker. Those are actually not necessarily subject to elemental psychology. They're based off of Jungian Myers-Briggs types. Now, to be clear here, Myers-Briggs is a version of the philosophy that Carl Jung? Oh my God, I should not be touching. I should not be teaching this. I guess if I don't understand the background of the people that I'm talking about. But Jungian psychology is a field of psychology that, to be completely honest, is very, very occult and very aligned with occult thinking. This is where some of the mythos behind archetypes and behind collective unconscious come from. It is also where the Myers-Briggs system and the idea of introverted and extroverted people come from. Jung was also sourced ideas of essentially the types that you hear about in Myers-Briggs. So that are the thinkers, the feelers, the sensates, and the intuitives. So it's broken down into 4 types of people. And I want you to kind of think about this not necessarily in the way that people are like, oh, they're such a Pisces, or they're such a insert X. Here's the quiz outcome that you did on BuzzFeed. I want you to think of this as, when I'll give myself as an example. I am an introverted feeler based off of the Myers-Briggs test. I am an INFP. So I prefer to use introverted feeling mechanisms in my life above any other tool. Think of it as taking a tool out of a toolbox. There is a tool that you prefer to use because you like it, because a lot of the projects that you do you tend to use that tool most often, that kind of thing. Think of it that way. You still use the other tools. There's still things in your life that you understand you need other tools to, fix the thing, to make a thing. So I still use other tools in my toolbox. When we talk about types, when we talk about, and when Kalila talks about her clients, she's talking about them, and you'll also hear if she says introverted feeler, sometimes she will also use introverted water. Now, this is strictly inspired by my teacher, Katrina Messenger, who wrote a book called Elemental Psychology. And in elemental psychology, she develops a new way of thinking about the Myers-Briggs and about typing people, and not just typing individuals, but typing communities too. And she also draws a parallel between the 4 types and the 4 Western elements. So air, earth, water, and fire. She draws those kind of conclusions of water being related to feeling, air being related to intuition, fire being related to thinking, and earth being related to sensing. Now, of course, this is her theory. This is the way that she has developed, not only from her own studies as a archetypal analyst, but also her life experience and her training as a witch. She is a amazing Black woman who was born and raised right outside of DC in Anacostia, and she was some of the first Black professionals to work in the telecommunications world in the 70s and 80s. So she has a lot of different, she's very systems based. So she drew this connection between Myers-Briggs and elemental types, and especially understanding that because Myers-Briggs kind of has been misused as like a career mechanism and ignores a lot of the occult nature, Katrina kind of brings that back. She brings it back to essentially the origins of what these types were meant to be. And what these types were meant to be was to inform you of your spiritual edge and edges and growth patterns. And if you're able to look at essentially a stack, I'm an INFP. That means that my primary is feeling, introverted feeling. My secondary, which it correlates with introverted water. My secondary is extroverted intuition, extroverted air. My tertiary is introverted sensing or introverted earth. And my shadow, and we will get onto this, my shadow, my inferior or 4th type is extroverted thinking or extroverted fire. Give me one second. I just saw somebody asked a question. Are there free or public tests for Myers-Briggs and elementals to learn what we are and to learn about dealing with others? So there are free online Myers-Briggs tests in particular. The thing to know about Myers-Briggs is that sometimes people get false positives in their test, especially when they're younger. And usually that is because, and I'll use myself as an example, I talk a lot. Anyone who's met me in person will see that I talk all the time, and that I love to speak publicly. I'm a writer. I like to, essentially I appear like an extrovert. And not only an extrovert, but an extroverted person who likes to, communicate things, to storytell, to connect with other people and talk to other people and talk about patterns around behavior and external community behavior. That is an extroverted, intuitive, essentially mode of being. Usually you will extrovert when you are younger because, that is how you appear, to everyone else. So you may type, even if you're an introvert, you may make a false positive as an extroverted type. So that's why these Myers-Briggs should be taken with a grain of salt, because sometimes it depends on where you are in your path. What are you presenting to the world? What are you truly and is what you're presenting to the world, and what is it that you're the tools that you are using, are they truly your strengths? Are they truly who you are and what you represent to the world? That's something that I've had to really struggle with personally, because I didn't really understand what it meant to be an introverted feeler. What does I mean, extroverted types, you can kind of get a sense of what they're like. An extroverted feeler, an extroverted water, is someone who's very, very like emotional and very relationship focused. This is something that I have personal experiences about, is that I had to ask these questions, and with the training that I've had with Katrina, got a little bit deeper understanding of what each strength and modality truly means and what it looks like. And that's why elemental psychology, bringing in the elements and bringing in the archetypes of water, air, earth, and fire, we have kind of preconceived notions of what they're like. As we start to dig deeper into these archetypes, and similarly in Kalila Stormfire, she uses those archetypes in order to have a better understanding of how her clients work and what her clients will best respond to. Because if you give somebody, like in, I believe it was the second episode in Water, there's this water fire conflict that's happening with her client. Her client is a I believe, introverted thinker, an introverted fire person. And she was trying to use magic that was fire oriented. However, it was fire oriented in terms of, like, she used candle magic. She used it in order to deal with bad dreams. And as you learn about elements and the archetypes of the elements, and as someone who's initiated in a tradition that focuses on these elemental mysteries, you get to understand that using fire to deal with dream issues, dreams are a water, have watery associations. So the idea of her client using fire-oriented things, essentially driving up and literally burning herself out, when she should have balanced it with water. And that is exactly what happens in that episode, is that there's a balance of water that Kalila brings forward for her. So that's kind of the general understanding of what elemental psychology is. Let me see. I saw a couple of comments. Yeah, exactly. Like I said before, how someone is in public versus their own personal kind of orientation really does matter when it comes to understanding who you are. And a big part of my spiritual practice and training, and this goes hand in hand with shadow work, is to understand myself and understand all parts of myself, understanding the personal, the public, the extroverted, the introverted, the light and the shadow. All those aspects of myself have been part of my training, and also part of what and why I wrote Kalila Stormfire for. Let me see, anything else about elemental psychology? Just to kind of give, a brief thing about, how I understand my essentially my stack of elements, or my stack of Myers-Briggs or Jungian types, however you want to put it. As an introverted feeler, it took me a while to get an understanding of what that meant. Really, what it truly means is that the tool that I reach for the most is my values. What matters to me? What is it that, what is the thing that I can pull forward? Water is a very much in some ways it's a hierarchical, but it really is just differentiating. I can differentiate things very, very well. I can differentiate what matters to me and what doesn't matter to me very quickly. But that's an internal process. That's something that other people don't see, but I'm highly, highly aware of. However, for a while, I didn't know that that was the tool that I used the most until it was brought to my attention. In some ways, you could say that, it was like, a fish trying to understand what water is. It was something I did all the time. So of course, I couldn't quite grasp that it was something different. It was something specific to me. So yeah, I think this kind of goes to something I've heard recently or something that has been going on in the internet, which is that some people don't hear their voice; they don't have an internal voice, and it blew everybody's minds, which completely makes sense. But as someone who does have an internal voice, I am one of the people that does have an internal voice. That it's still like I think I've heard of it. That other people don't have that. But it's interesting. Elemental psychology is not I will repeat, is not or should not be used for career placement. It is supposed to be used to develop your sense of self and your internal core strengths and the places that you need to grow into and what you need to better understand. So let's get to talking about shadow work. When we talk about elemental psychology and we talk about the Jungian modalities, there is an understanding that your first three modalities are things that you can actually grow into and master at some level throughout your life. And that you can integrate into yourself throughout your life. The thing that, according to Jung, you can never integrate is your fourth, is your shadow. So of course you can ask yourself, why? Why can't I integrate my shadow? Why like, don't tell me what to do. I'll say that that's your shadow speaking too, or just yourself speaking. What shadow work is kind of in how I've related to Kalila. In Kalila, so spoiler alert, if you haven't, finished the first season, I'll give you 5 seconds to get out of this right now if you haven't. What the fact is that there is a part of yourself, if you want to put it that way, that holds all the things that you hate and that you think is disgusting or that you don't like or that is annoying to you or that annoys you about other people, and your traumas, all the things that we don't want to look at and see about ourselves, that ends up in our shadow. So, for example, in Kalila, we make it very clear. I should probably use the I because I'm the one who writes it. I make it very clear that Kalila has a lot of issues about healing herself and about reflecting on how she doesn't really take charge on a lot of the things that, she allows people to use her. She allows people to use her, including the Coven and Sam, and even to some extent the rest of her community and her clients. There is something to be said about the things that you want to do and that you want to present to the rest of the world. There's a kind of niceties. In some ways, you have to present something else to the rest of the world, and that you have to choose who you are. But by choosing who you are, in some ways, you have to also choose who you are not, and who you are not goes into your shadow. I won't get too far into this, and especially how it relates to Kalila, because there's some spoilers that are going to, I don't want to spoil you for season 3, but shadow work is something that is lifelong. You will die without even if you did shadow work your entire life and you studied it and you worked with other people doing it, if you teach it, one of the things that my teacher, Katrina Messenger, has always told her students is that the work is never done. The work on yourself to understand yourself and work with yourself and transform yourself, especially in the context of shadow work, is never done. And I'll go back to my first question is like, well, why can't you integrate your shadow? Why is that impossible? And the reason why it's impossible, according to Jung, and according to the people, our archetypal analysts and other people that have done shadow work that I've talked to and the books that I've read, the things about shadow work is that your shadow is your shadow because it's not actually completely connected to you as an individual. The understanding is that in order for you to develop yourself, your individual self, you have to separate from the collective. So what the shadow actually is your last string to the collective soul. And when you start to think of it that way, that is massive. In the first season of Kalila, Shadow does bring this up. Shadow brings up the fact that I'm the most powerful part of you. I'm the one who actually brings your magic forward. I'm your connection to the gods. I'm the connection to magic and mystery. That is what a shadow is. Of course, there are parts of the collective that aren't really that nice and are actually, objectively quite horrible. So in the collective history of humanity, we have genocides, we have murders, we have patriarchy, we have racism, we have ableism, we have homophobia and transphobia. So yeah, the sobering thing is that your shadow is the most powerful part of you, but that still doesn't mean it's great. And there's still things that you need to work with. And some of that's not yours. So let's talk about what is yours. What is a personal shadow? And then I'm going to kind of end this. I know I'm about 30 minutes in here, and I'm going to try to keep this under an hour. The thing, I'm going to leave the community shadow stuff closer to the end. And if you're watching, or if you know somebody's watching, if you have questions about community shadow work, or if you have any questions right now, feel free to add them into the live chat. Thank you, Calmimo, for asking questions and commenting. But I want to make sure that also you guys have a chance after I talk about all the rest of this to ask questions about Kalila and everything. Okay, so personal shadow work. I will use examples of Kalila and I'll use examples of myself because let's be honest, we're very, very close in terms of Kalila's an introverted feeler and I'm an introverted feeler. There's a reason why I'm the one voicing Kalila and Shadow, to be fair. When it comes to personal shadow work, there are a number of resources out there, actually. There are a couple of books. I'm going to pull up the one that I really love. That's probably better for beginners. Hold on. So there's two kind of like main books of shadow work that I've referenced before. And the one that I've been told is good for people who haven't done shadow work before, it's a little gentler. It's a little gentler interaction. Is called Romancing the Shadow. I've actually referenced this book as well in the show notes for a couple of episodes in Kalila. It's by Connie Zweig, that is Zweig, and Steve Wolf. So that is kind of like a nice version. And then I believe the next one's called Shadow Dance. And that one is a little harsher. If you feel like you need a bit of a kick in the pants when it comes to the things that you're struggling with, I'm going to recommend Romancing the Shadow, not Shadow Dance. Just to be clear, if you have done I believe it's called Shadow Dance. Shadow Dance is hold on. Shadow Dance book. Yeah, it is called Shadow Dance, Liberating the Power and Creativity of Your Dark Side. It's by David Richo, Richo. And I will try to make sure that I'm putting all resources in the notes down here. And finally, the other book, before I forget, when I was talking about elemental psychology, the big thing is, again, Katrina Messenger, my teacher, is the one who originated that theory. And there is a book that she wrote a few years ago called Elemental Psychology, and that is by Katrina Messenger. And you can find it on Amazon. You can download it. All these are downloadable, and you can also buy direct. I believe that's there's probably a couple, if you're hate Amazon as we all do. You can find all those books by other means. All right, so personal shadow work. I will talk from personal experience. Personal shadow work is best when you are guided by someone who is either someone who has done shadow work before, or by a therapist who is familiar with some of the techniques to talk about shadow work. I had a really awesome conversation with a friend who mentioned being inspired by Kalila Stormfire, actually, to do some version of shadow work. And essentially, their therapist recommended a technique to essentially get them to a part of themselves that is very essentially that they didn't want to interact with, or was at an age where they were actually encountering trauma and were acting out, and having a reconciling conversation with that part of themselves was very healing and very powerful. And that is a version of what shadow work kind of looks like. And something that Katrina has taught me, and I don't really hear anywhere else, is this idea that all parts of yourself, all ages of yourself, are listening right now. So understanding that the parts of you that you rejected, the actions that you've rejected, that you've done, when you talk badly about yourself, the person that you were at 16 who did something stupid or did something that you as an adult now would not do, when you talk poorly of yourself, that 16-year-old is still there hearing that. And when you refuse to acknowledge that 16-year-old self will just turn to the shadow and be like, here's all the shit that I did at 16. You can take this and run with it. And then you can probably interact and enact more stupid shit as retaliation for this older part of me that is, being an asshole and talking down to me. That's how I kind of see it. That's how I hear when I talk down about my 16-year-old self. That is what I experience when I'm enacting that through shadow work. There's also another really good book called Personal Mythology that is kind of, it works with some of this stuff too, and it has actually some really good activities to unearth pieces of your shadow, incidentally. So personal shadow work is also recognizing that you have a dark side. You have there are parts of you that are petty, that are dangerous, and are violent and abusive. And this is not victim blaming. As someone who has been abused, when I accept the capacity of myself, and sometimes the fact that I did reenact patterns of abuse, accepting that and internalizing that was part of that healing process, was part of reclaiming the parts of my shadow, really, of and just simply acknowledging that that's where my shadow was acting out. And there's ways in which that I can address that and try to find ways to mitigate that. I can't necessarily completely change that, because there's some things that you can change about yourself and you can accept. But there's some things that are they're just part of your shadow. And I'll give you an example of how I realized that my shadow is way more powerful than my lifelong ability to even change myself. And that was a moment where I realized that you can be possessed by your shadow. And this was, maybe 2 years after I started learning from Katrina and being part of the school that she runs. And doing shadow work. This was 2 years after I was going through that work and that process. And I was really angry with my partner one day. And I wrote on my computer, I wrote a letter, just a really nasty letter to him. And I just wanted to get it out. And so I saved it to my computer. I, closed it, went along my way. And then about a day later, he comes to me and he says, "There's this file saved to our shared server. And I read it and I need to talk to you." And let's be honest. Let's be honest. It was chilling, because I had never saved anything to that server before. I didn't know how to save things to that server. I had no idea how to do it. I didn't know how to even replicate how I did it. And part of me sat in shock and realized my shadow possessed me and figured out how to share that message with my fiance, now fiance. We're still together, so clearly that was fine. Or we worked it out at least. But that was an instant where I realized that I didn't have control over the shadow. And that is the what in Kalila you see all the time, that Kalila doesn't have control over shadow, right? Kalila and Shadow's relationship is kind of more of a truce, and a very shaky one at best. And that is my experience with shadow work. And with my teacher Katrina, that is how she teaches shadow work. And she's always been really honest and admits when her shadow comes forward and possesses her. Thankfully, it's not very frequently, especially in front of her students. She maintains really good boundaries to make sure that doesn't happen. But that it does, that we're human and those things do happen. We get triggered and our shadow comes forward. And the thing in, the end of the first season that is mentioned is, shadow comes forward to protect Kalila, because Kalila refused to act in a way that the shadow felt was necessary to protect her. That is also something to ponder, is the moments where you act out and you act out of character and you feel like who was that person who left that text message? Who was that person who shouted at a child? Who was that? That's not me. And to be honest, it is you. You should take responsibility, but you also should probably consider whether or not that was a shadow. And what that means. What was the shadow trying to do? Why couldn't you, as the conscious being in this meat suit. Why couldn't you do it? And maybe that gives you a story that you can then interrogate and look at and hopefully get some understanding from. So yeah, so that's personal shadow work. Any questions on personal shadow work before I get into community shadow work, which is something that I'm really interested in? I'll let you guys, and I'll actually, hold on, I'm gonna just look at anywhere else in the internet where people might ask questions. And by internet, I mean Twitter. I think that was the, maybe Tumblr. By the way, Kalila Stormfire does have a Tumblr. You should enjoy yourselves. Go where at. It's still Kalila Stormfire. Excuse me. All right. All right, so we're still good on that. We have a question. Would you say that personal shadow work has been a fulfilling study for you? It does sound fairly scary. So shadow work, yes. I will say unequivocally, yes, it has been incredibly fulfilling. It has, sorry, I probably should have said this about shadow work in general. Shadow work, when you go through it, when you really interrogate the dark parts of yourself, of course, it is scary. There are parts of you there, and I've talked to other people, and I've talked to very close friends. There's certain things that they're not ready to interrogate. They're not ready to go down that, and that's fair. If you're not, if your core is not strong enough, that means that you need to build it up. You need to build yourself up first before you take on really, really heavy spiritual work like that. And that's something that Katrina talks a lot about too, is that shadow work is not for wusses. And I'm saying that in the nicest way possible. Not for people who are, to be clear, it's not for people who are currently not in a position and are, don't have the resources, both physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, to do that, to interrogate really dark places without support too. That is why I'm very, very lucky and very privileged to have been able to find a teacher who was able to support me and would literally, like, I met with her and I continue meeting with her twice a month. Not to specifically do shadow work. Sometimes it's just, having regular conversations about what's happening in my life. But she's very, attuned to, all right, it's time to do some shadow work. It's time to kind of try to dig into that little sore space. But to be honest, that's a support mechanism. It is making sure that you have a place, a safe space to interrogate that. And on the flip side, that you're also at the same time, you can't do shadow work alone. Sorry, you can't do shadow work as the only spiritual work that you're doing, because that doesn't make sense either, because you also need to build up the parts of you that are connected to what you truly want to do in the world. And for me, those two things do go hand in hand. But I would say that that was actually very purposely how I was trained. I was first built up. I was first given resources to look at my strengths with Katrina before we really delved into shadow work. So this, Kalila Stormfire has a lot of shadow work involved in it, but to be completely honest, at the foundation, it's about healing. It's about building yourself up, building your community up, building your core strength up, and doing what you love with the people that you love, and being able to help other people. Like those types of things of having, like, specifically having space, time and resources and connections to do the things that you love and to truly help people have space, and you figure out what is your unique thing that you're bringing to the people around you, right? That's also really important. So yeah, shadow work is very scary, and it's very challenging. At the same time, it does go hand in hand with also doing the work on strengthening yourself, strengthening your sense of self. And I will also say this: when you do end up, and if you do end up doing shadow work, one of the things that I've been taught, and this is something that is rampant in New Age. The Katrina pronounces it as newage, like sewage, because a lot of crap comes out of it, and a lot of appropriation and everything like that. A lot of those like self-help stuff is just that. It's just for yourself. It's, it talks about like, self, actualization, which is wonderful and it's great. What a lot of people don't talk about, and especially in like the new age kind of sphere, and something that Katrina has, again, my teacher, has drilled into us, her students, is that when you do shadow work, when you like reclaim parts of yourself and strengthen yourself, you're actually taking, and like the things that you project onto other people, like those parts of shadow work, when you start to reclaim those things that you're projecting on other people, and when you stop essentially reenacting trauma, and when you stop, or try to stop enacting things that will purposely trigger your shadow, you find that that's actually, you're taking something out of the world. You're taking something away when you reclaim it to yourself, right? Does that make sense? You're taking something that you've projected out, that you're like, I don't want this, that you've rejected, and you're bringing it back closer to you. That still means that you've taken something away from the collective, right? Like you've taken something. So the idea is that now that you've reclaimed something, you should probably give something in return, something healthier, something more generative, more aligned with life and with humanity. That, for me, is actually what it means for shadow work to be fulfilling. Is that I feel like by doing this, I am becoming a more human. I'm becoming more aligned with life and more generative. And that means that I have more capacity to replace the things that I've reclaimed, the shit that I've done and that I continue to do. I now have more space and more time and more understanding and more compassion and more resources to replace the things that I've taken and give something back and put something in its place that is a little bit more healing, a little bit more aligned with life, a little bit more helpful to other people. Essentially closing that feedback loop in a way, or closing or restart, or not restarting a cycle. It's break. It's literally, that is how you break a cycle, is not just by removing things. It's not how breaking a cycle of abuse is not simply just removing things and saying like, we're not going to do that anymore. You have to put something in its place. And that is what the kind of outcomes of shadow work are. I hope that answers your question, Asterisk Nova. All right, so I'm gonna get into community shadow work. I'm only gonna take about 10 minutes to talk about it, because we're already at 48 minutes into this. Oh, sorry, Fox asked about shadow dance, about why it was harsher than romancing the shadow. Oh yeah, so long story short, shadow dance has a lot more types of activities that are, in just my personal experience, are a lot more intense. They're a lot more intense. Like there's a lot more intense practices that are in shadow dance than are in romancing the shadow. And the practices in romancing the shadow are still pretty intense. So that's kind of like the kind of general disclaimer that I'll put on that. Okay. I hope that answers your question, Fox. Thanks for asking. ADHD, I will like turn off into various tangents or forget a line. Just feel free to remind me. Okay. Community shadow work. Community shadow work is something that in Kalila Stormfire I started to write about. That there in the second season we kind of start to get a sense of what that looks like with the community meetings between Janelle Grimmer and the rest of the community is working towards. It's simply, you know, it's a roundtable. It's like group therapy, right? But the difference between group therapy and community shadow dancing, and at the end, again, spoilers if you have not listened to the final episode of the second season, giving you 5 seconds to like peace out for a minute, I don't know, or to like take off. I will do this when I'm done, okay? At the end of the second season, Aphrodite offers to, and King Finvara offer to assist in community shadow work, because the shadow of Brushland is a manifestation of the city's shadow, literally, and that High Priestess Gabrielle Ravenwood is carrying that shadow. Again, not to spoil what this is actually going to look like and what's actually going to happen at the end. I want to, you know, be very explicit in talking about over the past 2 years in the audio drama community, we have seen a number of conflicts, especially interpersonal and very public conflicts. And so, in some cases, it's been harassment. In some cases, it's just been conflict. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that in any community, there's going to be that conflict. And I believe that the sources of those conflicts, especially the ones that end up going public and end up essentially roping in many, many members of the community, is a manifestation of a shadow, of a community shadow. Now, what's the difference, you may ask, of the obvious shadows of racism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism within the community? That, and what's the difference between that, like, you know, the big isms, and a shadow that's specific to a community? I think that really it comes down to being aware of certain patterns of behavior, of you know, the types of conflict that tend to come up, of the types of reactions, and the non, or the specifically like non-actions of certain members can illustrate what a community shadow looks like. In elemental psychology, in Katrina's book, Elemental Psychology, she does end with the book with a section on community types. That the fact that you cannot just, you can not just type yourself as an introverted feeler, or you can't like just generating a stack for yourself. You can also generate stacks for groups of people and groups of and organizations and even cultures and countries. That there are certain things that, you know, the culture, that group has decided that they're going to do, and decided things that they're not going to do, because that we're human. We decide to do things and we decide not to do things. But when you do it in that, as you do that, you have to be aware that the things that you decide not to do may drop into your shadow, and specifically your community shadow. So how do you deal with that? How do you talk about that? Like I said, you kind of start to build a pattern. Note things that people tend to do in the community writ large and what they tend not to do. once you get an understanding of what that actually looks like, you can start to generate almost like a picture of what the community's soul looks like and what their shadow looks like. I have my own suspicions about what the shadow of the audio drama community looks like, but to be completely honest, and I'll say this explicitly, that is not my role. My role in the audio drama community is not to take on the shadow of the audio drama community. Why? Because the actual who owns that role to deal with the audio drama community shadow is the whole audio drama community. One person cannot take on a community shadow. That is what is called, Katrina likes to call it the maw of need. There are homophobia, transphobia, and even just within communities, even within a group of 5 people, the shadow of 5 people, not one person, between 2 people, in a relationship, you cannot, as one person, deal with the shadow of multiple people. That is not your role. That is not anyone's role. And when I see is in any community, when I see someone trying to kind of like take on and fix this, what I'm seeing is, someone who's trying to throw themselves as a sacrifice to the shadow of the community. And that is not okay. That is something, sorry, now I'm kind of like on a pedestal here. I hope I'm not ranting too much, but I'm checking myself because that's my shadow. My shadow likes to, by the way, the extroverted thinker is the dictator. So if you ever see me become like a dictator, call me out. That's my shadow. That's not me. So if you notice, like I literally just caught myself from like, getting, all fiery, like fire and brimstone, because that's not who I am. What I am and who I am is someone who acknowledges what's important. And sometimes that's very actually tied. Like when I feel like something that is important is being threatened, my shadow sometimes comes and deals with it. So for me, okay, so what I really want to say about what is valuable about the audio drama community, I think is, for me, is essentially the voices of the audio drama community are incredibly valuable. And when we can truly treat them as valuable and see ways when people are not being treated as valuable, when we really see like who's not being treated as valuable, I think that's when we actually start seeing not just the shadow of, this community, but the shadow of any other community. When you see who is not being treated as valuable, that gives an understanding of what the shadow is, really, I think, at least. And part of shadow work as a community is acknowledging that and starting to talk about who is valuable and actually taking action to collectively acknowledge that. And even in the same way, maybe being honest about who you don't see as valuable. Really be on, if at the very least, be honest with yourself. Be honest with yourself and who you just clash with, that you just don't like as a person. Because in some ways, community shadow dancing starts with the self. If you're projecting something you don't like, or you see someone you don't like, doesn't that say something more about you? So, I hope that makes sense. All right, I think we are just about done. I am going to give 2 minutes. I'm going to just sit here and we're good. And yeah, let me see if you have any questions. I see 5 people, you stuck around. I love you all. Thank you. Yeah, anyway, you have any questions about elemental psychology, about shadow work, about any of the other magic that you've heard on Kalila Stormfire that you have a question about, happy to answer. I'll probably need to get out of here in like about 5 minutes. I have to go grab dinner. Thanks, folks, for thanking me in the live chat. All right. You're very, very welcome. Oh, I should probably also say again, because I guess I did this in order to, thank people for supporting on Seed and Spark. We are still a ways away from our 80% goal. So if you can, share our, our campaign, if you can support that, great. But if you can't, if you can share it, if you can talk to somebody else, or say even if they don't listen to Kalila Stormfire, if they want to pitch in a few bucks, and get a mug, and that's not a few bucks. That actually here is not just a few bucks, but that'd be great too. All right. Anyone who watches this after it's not live anymore, feel free to still send messages and questions. I'm happy to answer. I might not answer immediately, but I do want to help in the ways that I have a strength and a sense of self to help. So, all right. I don't see anything else. You guys have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend. If you need anything, ask the people that that can help you the most, right? Take care. And of course, as always, stay magical. Bye.